Thanks, David. Okay, so we'll get started. Stuart Powell, CISO Government of Jersey. I've been there since the beginning of my technical career. I've been there actually quite a long time, so I know where all the bodies are buried, but I also know where some treasure is. Okay, I was going to open my deck with who's heard of OS int? We've covered that, but prior to today, who'd heard of it? Okay, great. So that tells me we're broadly a non-technical bunch, which is awesome. Okay. I took the view that I don't really want to be talking about, in a semi-public forum, anything really internal about what we're doing with cybersecurity. It's been mentioned that, well, our adversaries might well be listening to this talk. So we did a first pass gathering on what could I actually include today, what could I confidently talk about. Two domains. One is the sort of information domain that we put out as an entity, and the other is what's discoverable in the technical realm. I'll focus on the left, your left. Yeah. As a government, we are subject to freedom of information, and that's probably a fairly rich source of information. Anybody on the planet can ask the government anything they like, and we're obliged, within certain parameters, to publish it. Fortunately, there's not that much in there that actually an attacker could use to mount a campaign or build information against us, but there are other sources. I'll come into that in a minute. I want to talk about Government of Jersey, though, for a minute. It's an island, it's a government. We're all familiar with what Jersey is, 100,000 people. But the government itself, the sector, is blue light services, education, customs, infrastructure, treasury, judiciary, hospitals, sewage treatment, energy from waste. So we have a complete mix of pretty much everything you can imagine, from financial systems to operational technology. It all needs protecting. We've probably got the largest number of business processes and applications in a single entity on this island, which gives us depth as well as breadth. The other image I've got here is of a typical one-person band, if I can say that. If they're digital native or cloud native, the chances are they've got very few things they need to actually take responsibility for protecting. I'll talk about responsibility a bit more in a minute. You may have seen this. As a service, it's a concept that the world's evolving to. Cloud services is software as a service. Now, if you're starting a stand-up business, you'd put all of your stuff in the cloud natively. You wouldn't consider building infrastructure anymore. And this starts to talk about where do the responsibilities of management sit. And in a complex organizations, we've got something in pretty much every one of these boxes. If you're digital first and native, you're probably on the right-hand side, where actually the only things you need to manage and worry about are your organizational and policy-driven stuff. All of that, all of the security and the infrastructure is done by the provider. So this isn't to be read or looked at, but this is a chap called Henry Jang. He's mapped out the typical cybersecurity domains that a big complex organizations need to consider, and they are numerous. I talk about breadth and depth. Well, the breadth and depth of the things that one needs to consider in a security program is here. So going back to that previous slide, as a government, we need to think about all of this, more or less. As a stand-up, you don't. But it's the difference between implicit and explicit. So as a startup company, you are considering cybersecurity. You're just not doing it to this level of detail. You're not giving each of these explicit consideration. But in a large enterprise, you do. So within government, we cover most of this through a handful of key functions: architecture, operations, governance, and audit. But in the center of all of this is business. At the end of the day, our job is to maintain the business. We're not here to do technology. We're here to make sure that the business continues operating. And whether you're a commercial business and your bottom line is pounds and dollars, or your bottom line is providing services to your customers, like a government service, it's the business that's at the center. So the plan. No plan shouldn't have a timeline, a roadmap. So I'll quickly run through these. 2015 is when the Government of Jersey, and the island actually, was subject to an external audit. So the Comptroller and Auditor General Office commissioned a report of cybersecurity for the island. One of the areas they looked at was government, and we have a report that talks about some of the findings in that report. But it also looked at CNI, critical national infrastructure of the island, and some of the private sector as well. The organisation did a few things in the background, but in 2017, the government published an island-wide cyber strategy off the back of that report. And again, one of the pillars was secure government. It was also the time the government appointed an information security officer, which is me, or was me. That role's evolved, and we've moved along the journey. Interesting, 2017 was a very interesting year in the world of cyber. We had the WikiLeaks Vault 7 CIA tools being leaked. We had the WannaCry and the NotPetya things. We had the Paradise Papers, those massive data losses. 2017 was a busy year for cyber, and I think set the scene for what follows. 2018, fairly quiet year with a couple of big hacks with Marriott and BA. And then I've lost my list, it's off the bottom here, I can't scroll. But in 2019, the government basically committed 13.8 million to a cybersecurity program. This is all in the public domain, so I'm not saying anything here that you can't find out yourselves. That was mobilised in March 2020. And March 2020 obviously was when the world went into lockdown. Being such a priority, the cyber program continued as planned, and actually we mobilised in the middle of a pandemic, and we actually started to deliver services purely remotely, which is a feat of program and project management in and of itself. I'll come to talk about the things that we did in a minute, but it brings us to where we are now, where actually the CAG, Comptroller and Auditor General Office, ran another review of the actual program management of the cybersecurity program. So not looking at the controls, but looking in the way that government mobilised and spent its money. And generally that was a fairly good report. I'll cover off what we do next in a minute. So as a government, the things that are super important to us are threat to life. We put business at the heart of everything we do, and one of our key parts as a public sector is running the hospital. All technology, all business lines these days have some dependence on technology. Previous speaker talked about someone who lost their life due to delays in medicine. Delays are the impact. And these are the things that we need to talk. I'll come to business resilience in a minute. But if we go around the clock there, environmental damage and disruption, we've got operational technology environments. They can be disrupted, they can be hacked. Major disruption to any of those systems will have significant environmental damage. Data protection, people. The majority of what we do as a government revolves around private privacy and sensitive data sets. That must be protected. Penalties, interesting, under GDPR, under the data protection law, the government can't be fined, but it doesn't stop class action suits being levied against us should we be negligent. Significant economic disruption comes from the reputational damage, and these two boxes on the left are pretty synonymous, but a major cyber catastrophe on the island that's island scale would have an impact on Jersey's position internationally. We are an international finance centre. Big corporates pump a lot of money through the island. They have to have trust in the island as a whole. So out of that deliberate spelling mistake up there, it's not the G in AC, it's the C in AG. 3 recommendations came out of it. Government of Jersey needs to define responsibilities and accountabilities for cyber or information security within the organisation. We must manage risk. We must get in front and do proactive risk management. And we must resource appropriately. None of this is rocket science, and these are all standard advice that you'd give to any board. In the published annual reports of 2021, it talked about the cyber programme. Don't need to necessarily read that, I'll cover that in a minute. But it talked about the cyber programme and how it's constructed. And critically, some of the 5 of the projects that we initiated at the outset in early 2021. So we procured program management, clearly a big transformational change such as a cyber program. You need a program management function around it. And then going around the clock on the right, managed security services. Again, I'm not going to talk to detail here given the context, but if anybody wants to talk into these in detail, I can talk to you discreetly offline. Managed security services, SOC and SIEM, typical stuff. People security, we've spoken a lot about people, process and technology. People is super critical, and that's the education piece that all organisations must have in place. Identity and access management, we talked about access controls and how we manage identity. There's some effort that's gone into there. Governance improvements. You can't start from nothing. You need to start with mandate. You need to start with policy. You need to drive you need to tell the business what's expected of them. And then finally, how can you protect stuff if you don't know what you've got or the value of it? So your asset management piece, you're defining your assets is crucial. Right, we've spoken quite a lot about Russia, Ukraine, so I do have a section on here because it's topical. We talked about Jersey being added to the list of unfriendly territories and countries. That's their publication on the 7th of March, where they named Jersey, along others. This list has subsequently grown, but Jersey was one of the first to be flagged up there. So we are in their sights, so to speak. And I'll talk about spillover and targeted in a minute and the sort of different approaches and and thought processes behind it. But essentially, the timeline is that from the Russian invasion to when they've put us on the list is a fairly quick turnaround. And I think that was as a result of our public position on supporting the UK sanctions. Interesting, Five Eyes intelligence agencies raise the cyber threat level. I think that's a constant situation that we're in. It's under constant assessment. And I'm led to understand that there's been a slight uptick in that recently as well, although I've not seen that yet. Okay, so I found this news article a couple of days ago, but that's an enormous amount of money going to Russia-linked hackers. So this isn't the state, this is organised crime. We've all talked about ransomware. Ransomware is our biggest threat, anyone's biggest threat at the moment. Ransomware is the most destructive threat that any organisation can get at the moment. I'll come back. I'll come to that in a minute. Oops. That's right. Okay, so just to talk a bit about ransomware and the concept of Russia-backed. They're run as businesses. So Conti is a well-known ransomware family or ransomware organisation, and they use affiliate models where you have one organisation that gets the initial access. They then sell that access onto the next, who establishes persistence, moves laterally. Then potentially they sell that on to another actor to basically elevate privileges. And then once they've elevated privileges, they seek dominance. Once they've got to that position, then again, those actors can sell that access on to somebody else that then has the tooling to drop the payload that then causes the impact. This affiliate model is becoming more and more regular. It's a commoditized environment. Some of these tools you can buy, and the dark web is full of these deals going on. And they have human resources departments, network administrators, finance, customer service teams. When you get compromised, you get allocated a customer relationship manager. That's the person you negotiate with. They run as a business. And consequently, and there's probably divided opinion here, to pay or not to pay is a big question. Generally, they will honour their obligations. If they say they will give you the key if you pay the ransom, they generally will do that, because reputationally, if they don't, people will stop paying the ransom, and when something gets labelled as Conti, people know that the chances of getting their data back are virtually nil, so people will stop paying, so it doesn't help their revenue. And actually, if you look at the trend, it is on a whatever that word is, steep increase. Okay. So we talked about actors, threat actors and threats. So threat assessments are interesting. I'm not suggesting this is ours, but it's indicative of where they sit on the spectrum. At the top right-hand corner, you've got nation state, super capable actors. And in the context of Russia, they and organised crimes are often synonymous. You talk about Russia-backed. Russia tolerate a lot of criminal enterprises within their country. There are offices in the Kremlin where it's known that that's where these operations operate out of, and they're tolerated. As long as they're not targeting or disrupting Russia interests, they carry on doing business, and they're earning a lot of money. So the challenges we face as an entity is that, we're a country in our own right, we're a crown dependency. We have to do everything ourselves, that's who we are, except for defence. We're reliant on the UK military for defence, but not cyber. We have to protect our own digital footprint. That's up to us to do as entities, companies, governments, what have you. Attackers are becoming more capable as attack tooling is commoditized. You can buy ransomware as a service. This affiliate model, you can jump into that process, and anyway, it's a complicated and frightening environment. As the world modernizes and as government modernizes, it does lead to increased dependency on technology. Increased dependency on technology increases the likelihood and impact of an attack. And the pace of change, just globally in terms of technology, we've seen what a pandemic can do in terms of embracing remote working. The world has changed. Cloud-first strategies exist, and they just extend your attack surface, especially if you've got a big legacy environment. So if you're an organisation that's been around a while, the chances are you'll have gone through that hype cycle of building on-prem infrastructure, taking control and responsibility for everything yourself. You'll have your big data centers. You'll have all of your hardware and technology that you must maintain. That's your legacy estate. That doesn't go away quickly. You need to protect and manage that whilst there's business wanting to drive and adopt cloud stuff first. So you've got this hybrid environment. That will never go away. And it's just every new innovation increases the attack surface. So our job as defenders is to try and keep up with the pace. And it's often said you need to sprint to stay still in this environment. So we've spoken at length about the Russia-Ukraine situation, and the spillover is the thing that affects everyone. A piece of worming ransomware malware that gets out of hand can affect everyone. That is where the basics help you out. That's where the basics of the critical path. When you talk about looking at organised crime and targeted nation state, the level of capability you need to implement is on another level. And I'll talk about how my mind works in that space anyway in a minute. But the fact that Russia's increasingly relying on organised criminal groups as a means to raise funds to combat sanctions, I think that's my opinion, is what I think will happen as the kinetic war sort of gets into a stalemate. I think Russia will look at other opportunities to bring income into the country. And the fact that they tolerate all this organised crime, I think the notion of ransomware will only continue to get worse globally. So these are interesting statistics. That the average dwell time is 3 days. So from initial compromise to landing the payload and disrupting the business isn't that long, really, 3 days. The interesting difference is that nation states typically stay in your environment hidden, doing their work, doing their exfiltration of data. They don't want to get discovered. They don't want to be disruptive. They want to take the information and maintain access for as long as they possibly can. You know, why would you signal your presence when actually you can just take the information away? The interesting dynamic is their now relationship with these organised crime gangs, which actually what they want to do is get in, wreak the havoc, leverage the extortion, get the money and get out. So I think we're going to see something change in that space. And then the out of hours bit is interesting. So if you are responsible for your own operations and you've only got a 9 to 5 technology team looking at your alerts, then actually 76% of cases happen out of hours. So if you imagine on a bank holiday evening, 3 days later, you come in on the Monday morning, it may be too late. In fact, it will be too late. I'm probably rattling ahead of time here. So we talked about the basics. So I think someone mentioned 95% of attacks or threats could be mitigated with the basics covered. Again, all of this content is stuff I've just scraped off the interwebs. If you do the basics well and you get the basic stuff done, you're pretty much 80% of the way there, in my opinion. Certainly for the spillover piece. Obviously, if you're being targeted by nation state, then yeah, you can patch and get all of your systems up to date. But if you lose a set of admin credentials, well, it doesn't matter how patched you are. So there are different levels. So once you've got the basics covered, then that's the time to start getting into the weeds. Miter Attack, if you haven't heard about it, is a open source provider system organization that maps out threat actors and the way that they work. And they map them out against typical vulnerabilities, and they can give you a heat map. So if you think that you're in a particular sector that's targeted by a particular threat group, you can understand by going and using this tooling. It's free and open source. What are the most likely mechanisms that they're going to use to get to your crown jewels? And then you can look at your own environment and do a mapping exercise and work out actually from a prioritization point of view, where should I be focusing my effort? If you've got limited resources and you know that a particular ransomware is doing the rounds, then you can actually look at where your weaknesses are in relation to the specific threats that are out there. But don't do that ahead of doing the basics. So what's next? More of the same? Probably, but maybe not. Yes and no. The IT industry has a reputation for fear-mongering and using jargon. And it's not helped. It's not helped the businesses get to grips with the challenge. We've talked about diversity. We've talked about it's not technology. It's a business problem. Well, business isn't full of same people. If you look at a typical board's composition should be fairly broad. And what I would say is look into the business. Look for evangelists. Look for people who can understand the problem and support you on your mission. Because there's nothing worse than a technician telling somebody that they must do something with no real context or understanding or explanation behind it. So it's looking for complementary skills, not techies necessarily. Although interestingly, the people that come into security jobs are predominantly from technical backgrounds. And that's partly responsible for why cyber is still seen in a lot of cases as an IT problem. And it's our job, and unfortunately we're mostly technicians, I am too, it's our job to ensure that we leave the jargon behind and actually talk in terms of business and business risk. Because at the end of the day, if an organisation suffers a major catastrophe, your IT department's going to be busy trying to get the systems back up. In the meantime, you have to still run your business. That's not a technology problem, that's a business problem, it's the board problem. So just consider for a minute, what would you do in your environment, what would your board do if all of the IT was down for an indeterminate period, and it could be months for big complex environments, how would the business continue? And if you're 100% reliant on digital, you've got to consider business continuity. And business continuity is not an IT problem, it's a business problem. So this is where the technology teams and the technicians and the cybersecurity professionals and the business all have to work together to move the dial on this. And the pace of change, if you remember that steep graph, it's not slowing down, it's speeding up. So actually, if we're going to defend ourselves, we need to sprint. So just to reiterate, people, process, technology in that order. Get the people to understand their role, get the people to understand the risks, then look at the business processes, make sure they're well understood, and then finally, look for technology to support. So this is a phrase I've sort of coined. Our job as security professionals is to make it unattractive, difficult, expensive, and slow to attack our organisation, giving us time to detect, contain, respond, and recover with minimal disruption to our business. So if you go away and you live and breathe this stuff, you should start making an improvement to your cyber resilience. The job will never be done, and I will close out with some other information that we publish as a government because we're obliged to. Thank you.
That's a couple of questions?
Yeah, we'll try questions.
Stuart, thank you very much indeed. Happily, again, bang on schedule. So I invite questions from the floor.
I found it interesting the timeline where you mentioned 2018 was quiet cybersecurity.
You're going to talk about privacy, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Okay, yeah. So
that's when GDPR and obviously the Jersey Data Protection Act UK Act came into effect. Do you not think the preparation work we did during that time set the priorities and influence what we should be doing around our special category data controls we should put in place?
yeah, thanks, Kim. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, May 2018 was when GDPR became enforceable. So Jersey implemented their data protection law, which basically meant the regulator had something to hold organisations to account. I think the island responded to it by looking at what's privacy, what's this thing about data, what can and can't we do with it? And I think it really shone a light on the importance of protecting and handling data in the right way. So you're right, Kim, absolutely. Protecting data, I mean, as a government, the majority of the data we have is sensitive information. So protecting it absolutely is one of our core missions. Privacy is the regulatory landscape, but actually privacy and security go hand in hand. You can't do one without the other. Thanks.
Or is it just that we're told to take the year off cybersecurity and do GDPR instead?
It was busy.
I don't think GDPR came into use.
Any more questions?
Hi, thank you. You said pay or not pay, ransomware. Naive question. Isn't it against the law to pay ransomware against things like nation states or?
Yeah, so any organisation making a decision to pay or not to pay needs to consider the risks of that decision. And it is a business decision. Every decision is a business decision. Yeah, paying a sanctioned state is illegal. So, absolutely.
I think so. But if you're not paying it, your insurers say we're going to pay it, it's their problem, not yours. Transfer of risk.
Possibly.
And that's one of the key areas.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, on that Pareto chart, right at the bottom was cyber insurance. I don't know if anybody's tried to get cyber insurance recently, but the bar to entry is pretty high. And it's getting higher. And
the family in the insurance game,
yeah.
they're talking about the levels of risk are increasing, the level of complexity of understanding that risk is getting more difficult, and as a consequence, he works for Aon, and he's saying that they're really walking a very small line between actually being able to offer it and
Yeah.
price themselves out the market.
Yeah, and actually the cost of an event, a major event like that, isn't just in paying the ransom, it's the cost of recovery. It's the cost in lost business. It's, the costs are, when you look at it, actually what insurance gives you at the other end as a payout, it's not a great deal.
And it's third-party risk. They're failing to actually identify.
Yeah. That's a good point, actually. And one thing I didn't say is that you can outsource responsibility, but you can't outsource risk or accountability. That sits with the board. And that's why it has to be a board decision. All of this has to be a board decision.
One more question from anywhere?
Over the side there. Sorry, earlier you mentioned people, processes and technology. What are some of the metrics that you recommend people show and watching today? What are some of the metrics which you recommend people should look at and then deal with those first two?
Yeah. I'd say, Matt will have eons and eons of advice and guidance on this coming out the cert, so I won't steal any of his thunder. But patching is a clear go-to, and some of your education piece. So from my point of view, I'd say making sure that you've got total coverage of patching and ensuring your timing of patching is reported, and any deviations from what you consider the baseline to be escalated up for decision making.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.
Stuart, very much.